I'll recognize myself for questions, and let me address my first one to Ms. Wilson. You developed a reading system that led to, quote, rewiring of the brain to function similarly to the brain of a good reader, end quote. That is amazing. Can you describe that to us briefly?
Yes.
Well,
Yes. The reading, do you mean describe the reading system briefly?
yes, if you can.
Yes, the reading system is based on Orton-Gillingham principles of instruction, or multisensory structured language instruction. And programs that are MSL, what we do is work with students building up their understanding of the language structure right from the beginning. So as you heard earlier, the student needs to understand how to process sounds and understand from what they hear how sounds work in words. And so you go right back to the very beginning and do that with your students. Beyond that, that's the beginning step. The students really need to understand how that sound system relates to the structure of words in syllables, right, and understanding prefixes and suffixes. So phonology is one piece, and morphology of words, which are the smallest units of meaning within a words. Right. So students need to understand everything about language structure.
Okay.
And it's words, it's sentences, and text structure.
Okay, thank you. By the way, you're familiar with Shakespeare quote that says, all's well that ends well?
Yes.
Sounds like you're saying all's well that begins well.
Yes.
On the other side. Dr. Talal, let me ask you a question, and that is, what is the best way to detect dyslexia earlier, just kind of what we're talking about across the board?
Well, interestingly, the precursors to dyslexia can be detected quite reliably, even in infancy, in the form of slow auditory processing. And my colleague, Dr. April Benesich at Rutgers University, found that children that were born into families with a family history of language learning problems were 50% more likely to develop reading problems later in life. She subsequently showed that the speed of auditory processing of simply detecting differences between two brief tones separated by small gaps of time was the single best predictor in 7-month-old babies to subsequent oral language development, and oral language development subsequently is a single best predictor for reading and reading failure. So there's this cascade, which I call the language to literacy continuum, which right, begins with slow auditory processing, which interrupts the brain's ability to effectively and efficiently process the sounds of language, which are necessary, are the necessary components, as we're hearing, right, for being able to hear the small sounds in words and learn that those are the letters that are in the words, and you can't really learn to read without that.
Great. By the way, I liked your earlier metaphors between the dial-up versus the high-speed internet and the country road versus the superhighway. That's a nice description.
Thank you.
Dr. Robillard, this is really just following the trend here, but what do you think is the quickest and most efficient way to test and identify those with dyslexia?
We have good tools. I think that we need to be applying them a lot earlier than we typically do. The tools that we have, I think, could be improved upon, and I thoroughly agree that oral language, our speech pathologists that identify our students at 3 and 4 years old for PPCD programs in schools would certainly be our allies in really identifying these students very early. Their screening that they do for that process could be expanded on fairly easily to identify these students that are needing this early intervention.
Okay, good. I'd like to ask you all a question, and we can start with Ms. Wilson. If you'll each give me 2 strengths that you all think are inherent with those with dyslexia. Okay, Ms. Wilson.
Absolutely, their perceptual strengths. So often they make wonderful architects and have incredible ability to see in different ways visually. Okay. Also, I think that they are often intuitive and are great at reading people and reading situations. And I have seen that in so many students who are dyslexic, that they are great people at perceiving people's emotions and strengths.
Good. Dr. Talal?
Yes, I would agree that visual perceptual strengths are often characteristic of individuals with dyslexia. I don't know which came first, the inability to process the rapid auditory signals, and so the brain had to compensate by developing stronger visual processing. But I'm never cease to be amazed at the number of cameramen who come to do interviews or whatever. It's not the person doing the interview, it's the cameraman who will often come up to me after the interview, often with tears in his eyes about his own personal struggle with dyslexia and the shame involved. So that's one. And the other is perseverance and hard work. I mean, don't ever tell me that these kids aren't trying or don't care. They try so hard. They just don't have the neural capacities set in place, and we can give them to them. I mean, that's what's exciting. We have the tools now to help them build this foundational structure, and then everything else we're hearing about is going to work better.
Yep, absolutely. Dr. Robillard?
So I would agree with the perceptual reasoning. I think that they're typically very creative thinkers too. They have to think differently. They're typically very bright, and they've figured out ways to compensate for not being able to read. And so that helps them be very creative thinkers. So they're often the people that come up with that solution that nobody else thought of. And I think their second characteristic that I see over and over again that I think helps partially with that perseverance piece too is they have a great sense of humor.
Excellent. Thank you all very much. The ranking member